main and branch campuses. Right, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Dr. Christopher Lazarus, and I am a senior lecturer with Tunku Abdul Rahman University College. I am so excited to be with all of you this afternoon and to have the opportunity to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Shanas Mohammed Zaki. Mr. Shanas is a systems architect for the Global Service Provider GSP team in Cisco Malaysia. He is involved in developing solutions for key service providers in Malaysia throughout his 8-year tenure in Cisco. He has been serving customers such as Maxis, Telekom Malaysia, and Celcom. His topic today is very relevant, not only for those of us who are involved in teaching and also learning about networks in general, but also for those of us involved in many of the university's current and future projects. Wireless 5G, with its promise of high-speed network capability, has the potential to impact on many Industry 4.0, Agriculture 4.0, smart campus, IoT, AI, and big data applications. So we are very fortunate today, and we are very grateful for Mr. Zaki's presence with us today. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Shanas Mohammed Zaki. So I pass the floor to him. Thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just try to bring my slides, yeah? Okay, Dr. Chris, can you see my slides?
Yes, yes.
Cool.
Proceed.
All right. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. It's been a pleasure to be invited for this session. And I've been briefly discussed with Dr. Chris about this before. My hope that this session can actually benefit all of us, including me. And the mode that I'm going today is actually light and easy. So I'll be touching quite basic surface of 5G. But if, let's say, any of you wish to double click on any of these topics, any of these sections for within this session, I'll be, I'm okay to actually entertain. And if there is anything that you might want me to elaborate further in a separate session or separate engagement, I'll be happy to do that as well. And just a little bit of myself. I think Dr. Chris has already introduced me. I'm actually based in KL, so I've been working in the field for almost 20 years now. So the agenda for today is that I'm just going to cover the basics of 5G and just introduce to you the standards behind 5G. It's important for us to understand, right? The standard actually be defined by motives, and it's very interesting that today the way that technology have been driven are actually slightly different than the past. Okay, and those drivers are actually from the industry players. They defined the use cases and the application in order for the standard governing body to actually formulate a specifications and standard. And then the rest of the session, I'll be covering the basic building blocks of 5G. Okay. Now, before I move further, right? The definitions and the terms that I'm going to use in this slides is slightly adjusted for easier understanding for all of us. Okay. So I do presentations normally to our customers who's probably in the field, and they'll probably understand, they have some depth of understanding in terms of industrial terms, especially in service provider market. So I actually had to adjust some of these terms and some of these jargons, right, for us to easier understand. But then again, if you actually bring this elsewhere, you might find it that it's slightly different. But then again, everything that I'm going to discuss here today is relatively new. So everything's kind of it's not actually firmed up just yet. So some terms are actually being used differently by different players in the industry, but they are similar. Just to caution you a little bit there. And as I mentioned, I'm going to be. It's a Saturday late afternoon. I hope that we can do this in a light and easy manner. So if you may, get this have this session lightly, and just perhaps get your biscuits and tea, and we'll move. Okay. So behold, 5G is not a new world order. So I think there's some weird understanding out there, especially in the US of all places, right? That 5G is actually meant for mind control. So I hope anyone here does not have similar ideas on that. It certainly is not. And what 5G really is it's just an evolution of connectivity that we have in the past and moved into today. Now, 5G is looking at enabling connectivity of almost all means, right? So I know that 5G always have been relate itself with wireless, because that's what 4G is and that's what 3G is, right? But 5G is not just wireless, right? It's for a lot of things. And the factor of developing such technology actually is more than just wireless. It's actually more on infrastructure build-up. And it relates a lot of technology, which I will discuss in terms of what kind of things I actually does pull through, right? And and it's going to be, it's an interesting fact that we will need to understand about, how 5G can actually impact perhaps our professional life, impact our personal life in the future. Okay, so 5G have been known, being defined to actually help the current industry to expand and modernize further in the areas of Internet of Things, cloud computing, manufacturing. We'll see more of those. Every day you'll almost see the news about autonomous vehicles where people do it, Tesla does it and other people do it with a makeshift car and all that. You see these kind of developments, right? And they actually rely on good technology to actually deliver good service. And those are least to mention, right? And there's a lot of other things that is being incorporated for 5G to actually facilitate, right? Now, I would start with the evolution of 5G. I think most of us here know where it actually starts, right? So in the 80s, it's the first cellular network that's actually been developed purely for voice. And then 2G came along. Data at that time was simply super expensive. Almost nobody used it, only for some professional subscribers use it, but not really on the consumer market. Everybody is just kind of use it for voice, and mainly at this time, only business people and professionals use mobile phones, right? And 3G came along, things started to be more wider and broader, but data are still expensive at that time. I still remember those period of time whereby, 1 kilobyte is like being charged for 1 ringgit or something. And if I were to actually use um, G, uh, GPRS at that time, it would cost a lot in my phone bills at the end of the month. Yeah, I mean, yeah, and 3G makes it a little bit better than that, but still a little bit expensive. And when 4G came along, you see a lot of changes, right? You see more and more service provider to give unlimited data, high quotas and all that, because the only reason behind it is because the infrastructure that was actually being built, number one is that they have gotten their return for their investment. Number two is that the technology are actually maturing. Okay. And then eventually you'll see how we actually evolve into 5G. So the obvious the obvious technical aspect of this evolution, we probably focuses on the bandwidth of the connectivity that this technology actually offers. From 63 megabit per second to 300 megabit per second. And what 5G is actually promised to give us is actually a connectivity beyond 1 gig. But that's not the only thing, right? The specification demands that the latency between your device to a service that you going to get, like especially the mission critical ones, is less than 10 milliseconds or much lesser. Okay. And then, but the real focus for 5G actually, right, is the masses, is the infrastructure which is capable to uphold or support more devices in a span of area. Okay, let's say in a stadium, for instance, if everybody were in a stadium for an event, for instance, I know that today you might be seeing that, and I don't think we'll be seeing that in a year or two, but in a stadium, if you fit 50,000 people, um, anyone who's actually been doing network engineering or wireless engineering, it's really a hard thing to beat. And people just, it's just hard to actually give a good quality of service, especially if you are based on the current technologies that you have today. Be it Wi-Fi, be it GSMs and all that, it's very hard to do. And this is what 5G is supposed to actually be delivering. Now, all these standards are actually been defined by TGPP. Okay, the way that they are, all the standards that we've seen so far, all the specifications is from TGPP, and I'll share with you in terms of who actually is TGPP. And the way that 3GPP actually does work in the past is that what they do is that they develop connectivity capabilities. They just develop things based on the bandwidth of the network that they can actually provide. They were just targeting that, okay, now we are able to do data transfer rate of 63 plus megabit per second, but I want to go more up to 300 megabit per second and all that. So they actually developed just based on technical references of bandwidth, as an example, right? And at that period of time, right, in early 2010s, right, it's just about Apple and Google creating mobile phones. Manufacturing mobile phones that were able to actually take advantage of the cellular networks. But even at that time, right, you will see that nobody like Grab today or Uber today, nobody like, any of the newest leading applications that we see today, right, exist at that time, and they wouldn't be existing today if the connectivity are not there, right? So they are there because the technology and infrastructure were able to facilitate their business, right? And for that, during those period, right, technology are being defined based on technical expectations. But for 5G is where the use case, the opportunities, the industry are the ones who actually defines the specification. So it's the other way around. It's no longer about just speed and all that. It's about how does the technology can be applied to these ever-evolving technologies. And they wanted to see this happening beyond consumer applications. They wanted to see how it can improve business operations, how they can actually improve logistics and all that. Now, a little bit on 3GPP. 3GPP is actually a bunch of people that comes from the market. These people can be from service providers around the world. They can be from manufacturers like Cisco, Huawei, Ericsson, Nokia. So they regroup as a governing board, as a standard board, right, to define specifications. So these are the folks who actually determine what be technology moving forward. And it's important for standards to be established because there are a lot of vendors out there, and each and every of these vendor needs to coincide somewhere in the service provider landscape, right, for them to be able to integrate. So 3GPP defines that standard so that mobile phones manufacturers, the cellular manufacturers, the network manufacturers, as well as the software manufacturer, all coincide in a common standard. Now, 3GPP have actually been doing developments actually prior to 2017, but um, as how it relates to our current situation today, they have released couple of version of developments, right? And there is actually, if you look at 3GPP website, there are actually developments which is beyond release 17. So that is actually meant for something which is beyond 2021. So they have released, if people to talk about 3GPP, this is one of the most common thing that they actually refer to. They will talk about a product or a specification for hardware or software is referring to which release version, right? So release 15 starts with a very fundamental aspects of 5G, is definition of the radio itself, right? It's where they need to actually start defining the radio. That they also define the control systems, the core systems that needs to manage subscribers, that needs to manage the flow of the connectivity. So that includes the entire architecture for 5G as um, a begin and initiate an initial period, an integration period of current 4G and 5G. There's actually an integration between 4G and 5G for this particular development because they are still trying to evolve. So standalone architecture. So SA is actually a standalone architecture, right? They call 5G SA. So 5G SA standalone architecture means that a system being developed which is isolated from any integration with current technology, which is 4G. So they developed in this period for industry players to make use beyond 2019. Sorry, excuse me. Next is the release 16 development. So further development of the 5G radio. So they call this the new radio. I will actually discuss afterwards. 5G does involve licensed and unlicensed band, and there is a lot of development to IoT and further efficiency in 5G. Example like efficiency in power consumption of the mobile devices, and there are more development in terms of the 5G core, such as slice management and network analytics. And what slice management actually does is that you have the same physical core system, but you are able to subdivide it for multiple purposes. I give you an example. Maybe people like Maxis, they have one core system in their data center, but they are able to virtually slice their core infrastructure into different purposes. Maybe slice one for consumer, slice two for public sector, for government service, for instance, and slice three is probably some of their enterprise IoT customers. So they can actually do that. So this is actually being developed under release 16. So the rest of the stuff like network analytics, time-sensitive networking, all these are actually being developed in view of the market ahead of us. And finally, on release 17 development, they take into account the specification to apply this technology in medical practices, in transportation, in logistical asset tracking, even for satellite intercommunications as well. So release 17 development kind of tells a lot of things, kind of gives some kind of summarization to what 5G is. it's been developed to address future use. So new technology are the driver for all these definitions of 5G standards. So you'll be looking at all these autonomous vehicles, drones, automation of drones in agriculture, augmented reality, high definition streaming video and all this. All this actually, they have this view today, and they tell 3GPP, this is what I want, and your technology needs to be able to deliver all this stuff, and 3GPP will determine what will be the specifications in order to successfully deliver all this technology, to deliver a good quality service for these services or these technologies. Okay, that's how 5G are actually being defined today. So it's very use case driven. So people, you can see here in terms of connectivity, in terms of fixed wireless access, maybe to provide broadband access for areas which is unreachable to fiber optics today, right? So, and another area which is Industry 4.0, connected vehicles and all that, there is a definition in all this, and they derive the requirements and actually came up with specifications whereby the speed of multiple gigs per second, the power consumption of mobile devices, the latency, the availability, and the coverage of what 5G needs to be tomorrow. I'll give you an example. So these are the few things that people in the industry are collaborating, working with providers, working with technology manufacturers like Cisco, like Huawei, and the rest, right? The biggest area that does this collaboration are actually from the enterprise market, not much from the consumer, but more of a enterprise development. So they're looking at all these technologies that they can apply to their operations. Okay, so here in a smart factory, they're looking at 5G to facilitate artificial intelligence and machine learning processes. Why does a factory requires 5G, a mini 5G in their plant? It's because factory evolve over time. They actually change the assembly part. The assembly lines actually change time for time. It depends on what they are supposed to be assembling. And when they move around these machineries, right, wireline connectivity is just unfeasible for them. Okay, so wireless service is more suitable, but it needs to deliver, right? It needs to deliver those kinds of technologies of the future, such as augmented reality and all the rest of high-end connectivity, right? And for that, you require a really good high bandwidth, low latency connectivity from the provider. Another example, augmented reality again, creating a 3D modeling of expanding the process plant, to extend pipes, to extend more refineries and all that. So in order for them to actually realistically go on the ground and look at how to connect pipes and how to expand their plants, right, they relate to the current installation and the simulated build. So they use this technology, and for that it requires for the engineers to be on site and move about. They are highly mobile, and they need to actually incorporate high resolution video. They need to incorporate the processing that needs to augment the simulated schematics into the current build of the infrastructure. And then we have situational awareness for drone automation. This is being applied for many occasions, for agriculture, for wide area of such as the solar field and petroleum, oil and gas plants and all that. So they use drones to actually do inspections and a lot of analytic functionalities. And in order for us to actually connect drones, which is moving to a large, within a large area, right, while streaming data, video and data will require such a demanding connectivity. And this is where 5G is needed the most, right? So these are the use case that the market is actually addressing to 3GPP in terms of what do they actually need, right? And lastly, slightly less demanding, whereby which is more consumer centric. So in the future, I mean, the expectation today is that, you know, especially when iPhone 12 is coming on at the end of the year, iPhone 12 has already been equipped with sub-6 5G. In Malaysia, we won't be having that until a year plus. But then again, if there's anywhere in the world, right, that have such service and they can offer, you know, this kind of augmented reality service to a user, right? The expectation that for this mobile phones owner, they are able to actually use it, okay, to actually enhance their experience wherever they actually go, to help them to guide them in the tourist areas, for instance, provide information about historical data and all that. So all these use cases are almost endless. The ones that I actually shared with you are the least that I could actually bring. There's actually a lot more. The ones that my company is actually working is together with Trastra in Australia. They are actually working on a mining facility that use huge trucks without a driver, no drivers at all. And that's actually happening today, even when 5G is actually not in Australia, because they do the development today. They understand all the key necessities, right? Understand the constraints, understand the issues, so that they can actually build better specification for 5G tomorrow. For that, I actually move into the basic building blocks of 5G. Now, there are three main things to actually support 5G development. The first one, obviously, is the radio. Second, the network to support or interconnect the radio and connecting it to the core services. Now, what the radio is what we normally call is the RAN, the radio access network. Okay, so the radio access network comprises of the antenna and the control units that determine how it actually works for certain specification or certain bands that it needs to actually support in a particular area. So I will cover in a radio in a short while in terms of what are the bands that are actually built for 5G. And then the next section will be on the network. This is where we'll discuss in terms of what kind of actually network that supports 5G, right? And I will tell you that network is one of the biggest asset entity in building a 5G network. And it's very demanding, and it's to actually support all these specifications that 3GPP defines. So there is a lot of expectation in networking. Now the last piece is actually on the core services. What core services actually does is almost similar to what 4G core services do today. They do like accounting and billing, authentication, subscriber management and all that. And they have user plane functions. What user plane function means is actually is as and when your mobile phone connects to the network, before it actually becomes a pure data going up to the internet, right? It hits the user plane functions, it's being processed, and then it's actually before actually being delivered to the rest of the internet infrastructure. So that actually resides on the packet core or the 5G core in the future. And we'll also be discussing a little bit in terms of what 5G brings, what are the associated technology for core services in 5G. We'll discuss about distributed edge computing and how cloud services actually relates into it. So, the 5G radio. Now, the thing about 5G radio, right, is that it's different than how it is in 4G and 3G, because 4G and 3G typically they have like one flavor of a radio, and for 4G there's just slight evolution, right? They have LTE and then they have LTE-A, but it's all meant for the same thing. It's meant for better bandwidth, better speeds for the mobile phones and nothing more. But the thing about 5G is that 5G thinks more than just consumer mobile phones. It thinks about all the masses of IoT sensors, the machine-to-machine communication. They don't need high bandwidth, but they need very low latency. So it's a different flavor for that. Then you need to actually support and enhance the experience of the current mobile subscribers as well at the same time. And then you need a super high speed for certain enterprise application. So there is no one radio size that fit for all of these, okay? So in that sense, right, 5G needs to have three types of bands, and where they actually reside in this is that if you compare to the rest of the wireless technology, which you might be a bit more familiar, like Wi-Fi 6, for instance, this is where it belongs, right? So actually 5G does make use of the current bands that we use today. So in Malaysia, what we'll see immediately of what MCMC will, or they almost award, right, last time. So what they will award to the service provider is the low bands and the mid bands. So we'll be seeing that the service provider will offer a 7 megahertz for the low bands and 3.5 gigahertz for the mid bands. For the millimeter wave, which is a very high frequency spectrum, but you know, if you understand wireless, high frequency such as, you know, a very short wavelength means that penetration is actually very low and the span of coverage is very low as well. So it's specialized. For the purpose is actually specialized. And this is where it sits between unlicensed band of Wi-Fi 6 and other future development of 60 gigahertz and beyond, which is unlicensed as well. So this is where 4G spectrum actually sits. And how do they actually play? So the low bands are actually meant for larger coverage but lower speeds. And they are comparable to what we use in 4G today. Mid bands are faster, but their coverage is slightly smaller, but not as it's not as too small. Okay, if you compare to the high bands, which is the millimeter wave, right? And all of these bands have a role to play. So in the 700 megahertz band, the low band is meant for big coverage to use for low bandwidth requirement applications, maybe for regular consumer mobile for the time being, or for certain type of period, maybe for IoT, such as AES, you know, the speed trap device that, you know, that they actually install in highways that is beyond fiber reachability, so they need cellular access there. So that's how they normally use for low bands. And the mid bands is most of in urban areas, in cities like KL. You will, because this area whereby the demography of users are actually more demanding, and where users actually wanted to see better experience in terms of video streaming, augmented reality, and so on and so. And this is where the mid bands or the 3.5 gigahertz actually play a role. And in the future, right, millimeter wave is meant for the future. And there are applications which is actually being developed to support this, but there's no demand for it immediately. It's just that there are developments for millimeter wave applications in the future. So there are devices out there supports millimeter wave. iPhones, which is sold outside of Malaysia, supports millimeter wave. But then again, for a mobile user, I don't see there is any use for millimeter wave because the bandwidth is so high. 1.5 gigs and beyond, 15 to 20 gig, there is no use for us for that kind of speeds actually. So to simplify this, right, let me just skip that. So you see that the low bands are meant for high dispersion. It's relatively suitable more for consumer mobile, for small IoT sensors that require low bandwidth but maybe high latency based on 5G specifications. And as well as that could actually meant for machine communications, right? And then the mid bands is slightly tighter cellular, which have a better demand, which has higher demand for bandwidth, video surveillance, connected vehicles. And the thing about closer cells is that it will give better positioning for the autonomous vehicles, and it gives better positioning for smart cities and all that. So if you have more towers, it means that you're creating more arrays of location sensors. So you can imagine what kind of location based technologies that require such infrastructures, right? And then we'll be looking into high bands in the future. So they intend this to be more for indoor applications, looking at manufacturing services, location intelligence, because the array of the cellular points are more tighter and large in numbers. So it will give you a triangulation of much accuracy. And they are looking at for smart hospitals, such as doing remote surgery and all that. Yeah. Now, radio access network architecture, it's actually an evolution of existing to new. So I do not want to confuse so much, but due to the requirements of the number of cellular that you need to have in an area, it does change the way that you need to hook up the antennas, right? So for that, right, you just imagine Wi-Fi today. In one period of time, right, it's enough for you to have one AP running at 2.4 gigahertz. It covers well, right? And the bandwidth is enough. But 2.4 gigahertz is no longer suitable today because due to the fact that there's just so many people using it. And there needs to be more APs lying around. So you need 5 gigahertz for that. But the thing about 5 gigahertz is that the coverage is smaller and you need more APs. And when you need more APs, you need more wireline links to connect those APs. So the back haul, the mid haul, and the front haul are just means to interconnect more antennas. It's just for that purpose. So the rest of the terms that you see here, CU, DUs, is just for reference, as you might want to relate it in the future. They are actually the control functionality, the distributed functionality of control the radio network. So in the past, or currently for 4G, they only have BBUs, which is associated to the antenna. In the future, these BBUs will be broken up into pieces so that they can support more antennas, but from a single control unit. So that's why you see there's a mid-haul application and front-haul applications as well. Another aspect that I would actually like to touch about RAN is that there are developments today which are redeploying radio functionality into virtual network instances. Okay, I'm not sure if have you heard of Rakuten in Japan. Rakuten is the newest and the third service provider in Japan. They're supposed to be going big for the 2020 Olympics, but due to the pandemic, things all gets delayed. But for you who actually probably keep in touch with the news, specifically in Japan, that Rakuten actually deployed a very revolutionary way of providing mobile service. Everything in Rakuten is virtualized and be deployed with cloud-based deployment. The only thing which is not virtualized is the network and the radio unit. The rest of the things that you see in the past who used to be an appliance is already being virtualized. Why do people do this? People do this because the radio unit on the left here, you'll see there'll be more of it, and it's just too expensive for you to actually deploy it in a monolithic manner. You need to break it up. And the best way to do it is to use a very commoditized hardware such as an x86 servers. And you install all these software elements in these servers, and you can grow it in large numbers. And the other characteristics of a virtual entity is that it's very elastic. Today, in an area, you might not see a demand to deploy a mobile service. But suddenly in 6 months' time, right, you know, a factory is being built and you suddenly need to build a mobile coverage there. And if you were to go with a virtualized infrastructure, it's much faster to actually be deployed, much easier, and much more less expensive. So this is OVRAN. The second section is about 5G network infrastructure. Now, I would have to say, to sum it up in the for the network part in 5G, right? Network actually play a bigger role. Although 5G is a wireless thing, but 5G play, the infrastructure is actually a much bigger element that needs to be managed, that needs to be controlled, right? In order to deliver the promises of 5G. Because 5G itself, on the far end, to the users, have huge bandwidth, and this bandwidth will eventually aggregated in the network pipes, right? So today you'll see 100 megabits, 50 megabits per user, and maybe 1 to 10 gigabit per second of connectivity is enough on the network for it to actually reach the packet core, for instance. But in the future, it's not going to be the same, right? It'll be a lot more. So what GGPP actually defines for the network, right? It needs to be high, it needs to be ultra low latency, and it needs to provide good bandwidth, and at the same time, it needs to provide connectivity to the masses. It needs to be very highly resilient. Why does it need to be highly resilient? Because it's not just the consumer is going to use the network. Now it's the enterprise, the critical service is using the network. So high expectation is required on the network. And the network needs to be intelligent to be able to do self-optimizing, able to recognize different sets of services coming into it so that it can get better treatment or less better treatment, and the ability for the network to actually construct or create service in a timely manner. Okay, so the wireless aspect of 5G is actually the tip of the iceberg. So a lot of bigger things actually on the infrastructure part, on the infrastructure asset of 5G. Now, the network architecture, sorry for the a bit busy slide here. So the network architecture for 4G is actually in the above. I put that so that we can actually relate to what actually 5G is. Now 4G is very simple. You have the radio units in the front, and all you need is actually a backhaul network to the packet core. And then for that, the data is being processed and transferred over to the internet. But in 5G, due to the fact that the antennas are expected to be in the masses because the requirements are high, so all the control units needs to be more. And what the service provider intends to do is try to break the control units so that it can have multiple components, smaller components to be, at the far edge of the infrastructure, rather than have big monolithic control units in large numbers. So they break it up so that the small things can go up front and the bigger things can be somewhere in the middle. And another aspect of this is that the architecture will define that the user plane forwarding to be more distributed, not centralized. Today, if you see like Maxis or maybe Celcom, you are connected, like you probably in Kelantan, in Penang or JB, but your data will likely be processed in KL. Your internet out will likely be in KL. But for 5G, that's not going to be feasible anymore. Your data needs to be dispersed as early as possible. So it needs to be sit somewhere within the region, right? And I will explain why in the core section of our discussion. And what is being strongly developed in the transport today my experience tell that currently the service provider, Maxis, Celcom, Telekom Malaysia, all are actually developing a network based on software-defined networking. Means that the network is able to be programmed. Like you're having a Waze before you start your trip, right? Before this, you are based on signboards in every intersection of the road. So you reach one intersection, then if it says go left, then only you go left. And then sometimes you only know that traffic jam ever too late, right? But with Waze, right, Waze kind of tell you upfront before you start the journey, right, which road to take. So this is what software-defined networking give to any traffic that needs to be flowed into the network, right? So in a simplified term, right, the orchestrator, the network controller, behave like a Waze app, tells the traffic which road that you need to take, right, for you to avoid heavy traffic jam, for you to avoid failure along the way inside the network. And it sets a different privilege for different kind of traffic as well. So some traffic, which is probably for best effort, they will say, okay, you have to go here, sir, because you're not paying a lot. And maybe for a higher critical service, like, for enterprise traffic, they come in, they will be given a better privilege going into the network. So all these things is required, to actually meet the specifications of 5G. Now, the last section, the 5G core services. I will try to cut short in this due to time, but there are actually a lot of options to provide the 5G core, and I just do not want to confuse you. I will just try to simplify it to you. Option 1 and 3 is just giving the service provider an avenue to make use of their existing 4G infrastructure and apply 5G into it. So it's like a transitional period. Okay. Option 5, 2, 7, and 4, it's like a service provider that builds the 5G core in the beginning, but some of them make use of existing assets out in the field, like the base station, the antennas, based on 4G. The only pure 5G deployment is actually on the option 2. So both the radio side of things as well as the core side of things are based on 5G specification. So most of the time, this will be for the new service provider or greenfield service provider, as they actually call it, a new player in the market, right? So they don't have any existing infrastructure that they need to carry. So they start new. And then when they start new, they can actually start with everything with new things. So option 2 is probably more viable for that kind of service provider. And this is just for your reference. And if I were to talk about so much about 5G core, packet core, or things like that, is actually a component of all these things. So if you were to take this slide away with you, this is the name of the functionalities. Is everything does separate functionalities, right? AMF, SMF. So they do subscriber management, like authenticating the SIM cards and allowing privilege for the SIM card and what kind of service, and it does accounting for the SIM cards and all that before it actually tells the UPF to allow the user to go out into the internet. And this is typically resides on the central data center of the service provider. And the thing that I'm showing you here now is that the blue boxes are the new things that the 5G core provides. The green boxes is the existing things that the 4G currently able to provide as well. So the key element about 5G standalone architecture is, I would say, the end-to-end network slicing, where it can virtually segregate the core into multiple purpose for different sets of customers perhaps, and it can actually do certain level of control like QoS and all that, and you can actually do an enterprise service delivery. In the past, like 4G, right? Why isn't any government or private companies deploy their own enterprise core? Because it's just way too expensive. But the thing about 5G core is because it's based on software, means that the cost of actually building such things, right, in a data center is actually much lower and much smaller in terms of the scale of the software. So the cost is actually smaller, and that gives an opportunity for enterprise to have their own core, to have their own cellular network if they wanted to. Yeah, this is what I meant about, so all these functionality are actually like sitting in a LAN. Okay, if you're familiar with LAN networking, then in the past, it's not. It's hardwired between one component to another. But all these functions can actually be visualized, and they can be inter-networked in a common LAN, like a common LAN. This is the idea. So this is one of the new things which we call service-based architecture for the 5G core. Now, the last aspect that I like to go for the 5G core is the edge computing factor in the 5G architecture. Due to the fact that traffic are getting higher going in, right, from the users, from the access, right, down below here, then there is a need to process that traffic in a distributed manner so that, you know, it does not converge in a huge aggregated amount of traffic in the center. It can actually be dispersed into multiple locations, such as maybe northern area, you have one edge nodes that can cover Kelantan, Penang, Perlis, and Kedah. And then another edge node in the south can cover Johor Bahru, Malacca, and probably one edge node in Sabah and Sarawak. So you disperse all that for that it actually able to process localized traffic. And the other factor of that is that this is the reason why we are moving the user plane function closer to the subscriber number, because it gives an opportunity for CDN or content provider to be closer to you. So just like in any networking means, right? Let's say I'm not sure if any of you are gamers out there. So if you like have a gaming server right in your house, right, you would know how your game would actually, the experience of your gaming will be, right? Rather than that game server sitting somewhere like Singapore. Similarly, like Netflix, YouTube, Google, and Amazon, if the services are sitting nearer to you, like maybe a few tamans across your neighborhood, right, then the experience obviously will be much better. So the user data can actually hop into this so-called content distribution centers. It can be deployed nationwide. And the idea here is actually to reduce latency and increase customer experience. At the same time, it reduces the influx of traffic going into the main network, because the access area of the 5G infrastructure is already loads, heaps amount of traffic, and you need to actually disperse that. And the traffic needs to just go to the nearest destination rather than being happen somewhere in KL, then go out again elsewhere. Okay, so that's edge computing in a nutshell. Of course, edge computing that can actually be deployed for localized deployment means that an enterprise or a factory, for instance, they can have their own edge compute somewhere, and they can actually host a 5G network in their plant and then process the data locally without ever going into the service provider data center and coming back again, right? So this is the technology drivers that is being incorporated into 5G. So I'm coming in end to my session. Just for me to summarize, right? So 5G is actually not just about wireless 5G. It gravitates new opportunities and technologies. So everything that you think about, I think Dr. Chris did give a very good opening earlier on, whereby the association of 5G is with IR 4.0 and a lot of other things, right? So there are a lot of play associated to 5G, virtualization, network infrastructure, everything. Nothing is obsolete to actually support and facilitate 5G services. Okay, the only if I were to ever close this session, if I were to summarize all of this, right, it is a question that I ask every day, right? Where do we fit in all this, right? So as I mentioned to you in the earlier slides, right, whereby the way that 5G is actually being developed is being developed based on use case. So people are applying a lot of thoughts in developing 5G, and they are based on applications or use cases. And we can play many roles in that sense. We can be in the infrastructure setup, we can be in the end user setup, all playing a role, trying to figure out and stitching the knots of how these technologies should interwork. If I were to close all this I would say that 5G will be the next biggest turning point for all of us. And for us to actually be relevant, it requires us a new way of thinking. And then we use our IT knowledge as a foundational platform to start, right? And as we move further out there in the market is whereby we understand the problems that they have today. And how do we actually need to solve it using the new technologies and the foundational knowledge that we have. We relate and we need to apply to those problems. And the most important thing, if I were to just share with all of you, is that we all need to be very passionate about what we are solving. And for that, I will conclude my session. And I pass it over to Dr. Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. First of all, I want to say that I think back to first slide, I don't think there's any worry that any of us think that 5G is used for mind control, and also that it caused COVID-19. We all know better, yeah, everyone. Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Shamnas. You have managed to, explain very difficult concepts in 1 hour of 5G, yeah, to make it easier for us to actually understand what's going on, not only from the networking point of view, but also the implementation by the industry and how it all is supposed to improve different aspects of our lives. Yeah. And just to further on talk about the use cases in our own university, a lot of our students and our lecturers are also in the midst of doing a lot of projects with the industry that involve agriculture 4.0, industry 4.0, IoT, and drones, and all these projects actually could benefit a lot from 5G when it is actually implemented widely in Malaysia. So it gives us a pause for thought, yeah, on how we can work projects towards that when it comes. Right? Uh,
Fantastic, fantastic.
yeah. And so on behalf of everyone from Tunku Abdul Rahman University College, we thank you, Mr. Shanas Muhammad Zaki, for a very enlightening, I would say, and informative presentation. Thank you very much. Right. So,
Thank you
yeah,
all.
thank you, thank you. Right, for everyone
Bye
else,
bye.
thank you for tuning in for our talk. Yeah, today. Hope you have again a lot of knowledge. Yeah, thank you. Right.